The basement of the Denver Community Church smells like old hymnals and lemon polish, fluorescent lights humming overhead in that particular way that makes time feel suspended. Laura Bennett arranges gauze pads along the metal shelf with surgical precision, each stack aligned to the millimeter, her hands moving with the automatic competence of someone who has done this 10,000 times before. She's been organizing this first aid station every Sunday morning for 3 years, and nobody has ever asked her name beyond the clipboard she signed on her first day. The supplies are meager: Band-Aids, antibiotic cream, ice packs, a blood pressure cuff from 2008 that reads low by about 4 points. She's already corrected for it in her head. The tremor starts when the footsteps begin descending the basement stairs. Laura doesn't pause. She continues her inventory, counting out elastic bandages, her jaw tightening just slightly as the footsteps grow louder. The tremor isn't fear. It's restraint. After 13 years of keeping her hand steady while men died in her arms, a Sunday morning in a church basement should be manageable. She touches the edge of the metal supply closet, cold stainless steel against her fingertips, and breathes once, the kind of breath that takes 3 full seconds to complete. Pastor Dale Hargrove enters the basement at 9:13 a.m. He wears pressed slacks and a polo shirt embroidered with the church logo, and he surveys the space the way a man surveys property he owns. His smile arrives before his words, thin and practiced, the smile of someone who has learned that warmth can be weaponized if you time it correctly. He's 53, with the kind of jawline that photographs well in the church newsletter, and he has perfected the art of making volunteers feel both essential and replaceable in the same conversation. Laura. He says her name like a question mark. I wanted to speak with you about Sunday operations. She turns slowly, keeping her hands visible on the counter, keeping her posture relaxed. Her volunteer badge clattered against her sternum 3 hours ago when she bent down to pick up dropped supplies, and she'd flinched at the sound like it was gunfire. Good morning, Pastor. The station is fully stocked. I can see that. He descends the last 3 steps, his footsteps deliberate on the tile floor. You know, we had a volunteer committee meeting last week. Discuss safety protocols for the fellowship hour. New liability waivers for anyone administering first aid. Laura returns to the gauze. Her hands are steady now. I reviewed the email. I'm prepared to implement any changes. You didn't attend the meeting. I work Saturday nights at Mercy General. I was sleeping. Hargrove moves closer to the supply station, his presence making the air in the basement feel narrower, denser. He picks up one of the elastic bandages and examines it like an inspector. The board decided we need to require direct pastoral approval before any volunteer provides medical assistance. For liability purposes. Even simple first aid. I understand. Do you? He sets the bandage down, and his smile sharpens slightly. Because the current arrangement, you down here playing nurse without explicit authorization, it puts the church at risk. We're not a hospital, Laura. We're a faith community. She continues organizing. Her voice comes out flat, professional, the voice she uses with residents at the hospital who are testing her patients. I hold current CPR certification. I'm trained in basic first aid. I've been volunteering for 3 years without incident. Trained where? The question hangs there. She doesn't miss the way he asked it, not where, but where, the inflection of someone who knows he's touched a nerve. Laura's hands pause for exactly 1 second. 1 second is too long. Red Cross certification. Online course. He nods slowly, like he's filing information away in a cabinet he plans to open later. I want you to understand the new policy. If someone comes down here with a scrape or a minor issue, you refer them to me. I'll decide if medical intervention is necessary. We can't have volunteers making medical judgments about what constitutes an emergency. He adjusts his watch, a Rolex that catches the fluorescent light. It's about maintaining order. Structure. Knowing who's in charge and who's not. Laura's shoulders don't tense. Her jaw doesn't clench. She turns to face him, and her eyes are the color of a winter Atlantic, flat and impenetrable. When she speaks, her voice sounds like someone reading from a manual about acceptable workplace communication. I'll follow the new protocol. Direct approval before treatment. I'll post the policy here for volunteer reference. Good. Hargrove smiles, and this smile is genuine because he's won something. He's established boundaries and she's accepted them without argument. You're a good volunteer, Laura. Reliable. Quiet. That's what we need here. Not showboats. Not people trying to be more than they are. She doesn't respond. She returns to the gauze. He lingers for another 15 seconds, long enough for her to feel the weight of his attention, short enough that she can't complain about it. Then his footsteps move toward the stairs, back up to the sanctuary where the congregation is arriving, where the 10 a.m. service will begin in exactly 13 minutes. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, and Laura counts her breaths the way she was taught in Baghdad. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Release. In the corner of the supply closet, beneath a stack of old first aid textbooks she's kept since 2009, sits a pair of worn combat boots. The leather is cracked and faded from desert heat and rain that came too late. The left boot has a small hole in the toe where shrapnel grazed it in 2011, in a place she doesn't talk about. She touches them once before each shift, her fingertips brushing the rough leather like a talisman, like they're proof that she existed once as something other than a volunteer organizing band-aids in a church basement while a man named Hargrove explained structure to her. The footsteps fade. The sanctuary door closes. Laura finishes her inventory, checking the oxygen tank she keeps hidden in the back, not authorized, never mentioned to anyone, replaced every 6 months using her own money. She checks the pressure gauge, full. She double-checks the needle decompression kit she assembled 2 years ago, the 14-gauge angiocath needle and the sterile alcohol prep pads kept in a small pouch beneath the bottom shelf. Nothing official. Nothing documented. Just equipment and knowledge that might save someone's life if the moment ever came, if she ever had to stop being a volunteer and start being something else. That's when the footsteps start again. But these aren't Hargrove's footsteps. These are younger, heavier, the kind of footsteps that come downstairs like someone's descending into battle. A young man in marine dress blues emerges from the stairwell, and his breathing is already wrong. His breathing is shallow and rapid, and his hand is pressed against his chest, and his face has that particular shade of grey that Laura's seen exactly 47 times before. Hypoxia. Respiratory distress. The look of someone whose lungs are closing down like fists. I need, his voice comes in short bursts. Someone. Help. Laura's face doesn't change. Her composure is like a steel door sliding shut. She moves toward him with the kind of efficiency that looks casual to someone who doesn't understand it, but is actually the result of 13 years of muscle memory taking over. Sit down. Right now. He sits on the basement step. She's already moving to the oxygen tank, already checking his vital signs by the way his neck veins are distending, already running through the diagnostic tree in her head with the speed of a combat surgeon who's seen this scenario play out while mortars were landing outside the tent. Asthma attack. Severe. Possibly anaphylaxis. His pupils are dilated and his skin is clammy and she can hear the wheeze from 6 feet away, high-pitched and desperate. Name, she says, kneeling down. Jensen. Marine Corporal David Jensen. But that wasn't the worst part. What neither of them knew, what nobody in that basement could have possibly understood, was that Corporal David Jensen's father was General Marcus Hale, Army Ranger, 3-star Command Authority, currently stationed at JBMDL with operational oversight of 3 continental regions. What neither of them knew was that Corporal Jensen had been briefed on a classified extraction operation in 2009, an operation that had been erased from every database except one heavily redacted file in a Pentagon safe. What neither of them knew was that the woman kneeling in front of him, the volunteer with the tremor and the faded scrubs, had been the one running point on that extraction. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. The one who was supposed to disappear. The one who had been buried so deep in classified records that even her own son's school principal didn't know what his mother actually was. Laura's hands moved with automatic precision as she positioned the oxygen mask, her fingers steadier than stone, her voice dropping into that register that came from somewhere else entirely. Breathe slow. In through your mouth. I'm right here. She didn't know that Corporal Jensen was about to watch her save his life. She didn't know that he was about to find out exactly who she was, or that her identity would ripple outward like artillery fire through every level of the military command structure. What she did know was that a young man was dying in front of her, and that Pastor Hargrove had just told her she needed his approval before she could treat anyone. She already had the oxygen running. The oxygen was already running when Corporal Jensen collapsed in the third pew. Laura heard the gasp before she saw him, that particular sound of lungs closing, of air refusing to move. 10 years of field medicine made it unmistakable. She was halfway up the basement stairs when his body went rigid against the wooden bench, his uniform suddenly too tight, his hands clawing at his own throat. The Sunday morning service fell silent. She moved through the congregation without asking permission, her footsteps purposeful across the tile floor, muscle memory overriding every institutional protocol Pastor Hargrove had outlined 7 days earlier. The young Marine's lips were already developing that blue tint around the edges. Cyanosis. Severe asthma attack, and he was spiraling fast. Laura knelt beside him, her hands already moving to her supply bag, the one she kept in the basement, hidden behind the communion supplies where Hargrove couldn't restrict it. She pulled out the emergency inhaler, placed it against Jensen's mouth, and steadied his trembling shoulders. "Breathe with me," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational. In through the mouth. Hold it. Out through the nose. Pastor Hargrove appeared at the edge of the pew within seconds, his expression hardening into something that resembled a predator recognizing a threat. "Step back," Hargrove commanded. "That's church business." Laura ignored him completely. She was counting Jensen's breathing, too shallow, too fast. The inhaler wasn't enough. She pulled out her portable oxygen concentrator, positioned the nasal cannula, and adjusted the flow to 4 liters. The hiss of oxygen filling the tubing sounded like a small storm in the silence of the sanctuary. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes. By then, Jensen's oxygen saturation was climbing, his respiratory rate normalizing, color returning to his face. The lead paramedic, a woman named Chen who'd trained with Laura at Mercy General, took one look at the setup and nodded with professional respect. "Good work," Chen said quietly, sliding the portable unit into their equipment case with practiced efficiency. But Hargrove was staring at Laura with an expression that made the temperature in the sanctuary drop by 10 degrees. The following Sunday, the sermon was about obedience. Laura sat in the basement, arranging bandages in neat rows, when she heard Hargrove's voice traveling down through the old ventilation system. His words were crafted with the precision of someone who'd spent years practicing control. "We have volunteers," he said, his tone suggesting a problem had emerged. "Dedicated people, yes. But some of them seem to believe they understand medical care better than those actually in authority." The pews above creaked as people shifted, leaning forward. Laura's hands continued their work, but she was listening to every word. "Our little first aid helper downstairs thinks she can practice medicine in this house of God without even asking permission." A pause. Then, without proper supervision from leadership. Light laughter rippled through the congregation, the kind of laughter that comes when people aren't quite sure what they're laughing at, so they follow the lead of the man in the pulpit. "I'm making a friendly wager," Hargrove continued, his voice dripping with false warmth. "I don't think she'll last a week under proper supervision. Any takers?" More laughter. Louder this time. Laura set down the bandage roll and looked at her hands. They were steady. They'd been steady in Baghdad. They'd been steady holding a young lieutenant's hand while medevac helicopters approached. Steady hands didn't shake just because a man in a collar wanted them to. The fellowship hall was crowded after service, the usual after-church gathering where coffee was weak and conversations were genteel and nothing real ever actually happened. Laura was pouring coffee into a foam cup when she felt him approach. Pastor Hargrove appeared at her elbow like a shadow that had learned to move independently. He was smiling, but it was the smile of someone who'd already decided something about her. "Sweetheart," he said loudly enough for the crowd to hear, "I'm making a friendly wager. You won't last a week under proper supervision." She turned to face him, cup still in hand. "I understand you have concerns," Laura said. The words came out measured and professional, the way a person speaks when they're trying not to say what they actually think. That was when he moved his arm. The motion looked accidental, a casual bump of his elbow against her wrist, the kind of thing that happens in crowded spaces. But nothing about it was accidental. Hot coffee splashed across her lap, soaking through her scrub pants, the heat shocking against her skin. Her cup clattered against the tile floor with a sound like a small bell. For one moment, the room held its breath. Hargrove bent down, slowly, deliberately, and picked up her medical supply clipboard from where it had landed. He stood, holding it for a second, then let it fall at her feet. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice still public, still loud. "Wouldn't want anyone tripping." His smile was a wolf showing its teeth. Laura knelt. Her movements were deliberate, controlled. She retrieved the clipboard from the floor, feeling the burn of coffee cooling on her skin, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes. A single tear escaped, not from pain, but from something else, something that lived behind her ribs where she kept her real history locked away. She wiped her face without breaking eye contact as she rose. "A man of God shouldn't fear a woman with band-aids," she said. Her voice was devastatingly calm. There was no anger in it, no tremor, no rising pitch. Just a statement of fact, delivered like she was reading off a supply inventory. The words landed in the fellowship hall like someone had just switched off all the noise at once. The room went dead silent. Hargrove's smile faltered for just a moment, a fractional twitch at the corner of his mouth, and then he turned away, moving toward a group of board members near the pastries. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that neither Laura nor Pastor Hargrove knew that Corporal Jensen's call to his father that evening would change everything. The young Marine was sitting in his barracks, still shaky from the asthma attack, still thinking about the woman who'd saved his life in the sanctuary. "Dad," Jensen said into the phone. "I need to tell you about something." His father was General Marcus Hale, commanding officer of the 75th Ranger Regiment. The same general whose Rangers operated in the same classified zones where Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett had once been a shadow on the sand. The same general who could rewrite official records. The same general who was about to discover that the woman who'd saved his son's life was someone the Pentagon had been searching for without knowing her name. 2 weeks later, Laura was adjusting the blood pressure cuff on an elderly volunteer when she noticed something wrong with Walter Krantz's breathing. The sound was shallow, ragged, like someone trying to suck air through a plastic bag. She'd heard that sound once before, in Fallujah, in the emergency clinic behind the checkpoint where she wasn't supposed to exist. Tension pneumothorax. Krantz was an 83-year-old decorated veteran, a fixture at the church fundraiser, standing near the dessert table with a paper plate of brownies. He was talking to a young woman about his service in Vietnam when his knees simply folded. He hit the floor like someone had cut his strings. Laura moved before anyone else's brain had even registered that something was wrong. She was already on her knees, already pulling out the supplies she kept hidden beneath the first aid table, the supplies that included things a church volunteer definitely shouldn't have. "Call 911, she said to the nearest person, her voice steady and commanding. Not a request. A command. Hargrove pushed through the crowd within seconds, his face red, his voice cutting through the gasps of the other volunteers. "Step away from him. You're practicing medicine without a license. Laura, step back immediately." She didn't acknowledge him. Her hands were already assembling the kit, a 14-gauge needle, positioned perfectly at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The spot where you push air out of a chest when the lungs are collapsing. The spot where someone either gets treated in the next 30 seconds or stops breathing altogether. Hargrove grabbed her shoulder. His grip was hard, demanding. She performed the needle decompression in one smooth motion. The hiss of escaping air filled the fellowship hall, that particular sound of pressure releasing, of life being returned to something that was dying. Krantz's chest expanded visibly. Color rushed back into his face like someone had turned on a light behind his eyes. Paramedics arrived in 6 minutes. They confirmed what she already knew: the needle had worked. The patient was stable. The patient would live. Chen was with them this time too. She took one look at the setup, the placement of the needle, the way Krantz was already breathing normally, and she simply nodded. Professional recognition between people who actually understood what had just happened. "Nice work," Chen said quietly. But Hargrove's expression promised this wasn't over. It was the look of someone who'd realized they'd underestimated the threat in their sanctuary, and now they were going to do something about it. That night, he made the first call. The phone call started at 7 in the morning on Monday. By Tuesday, they had multiplied into a network of institutional gravity that pulled toward a single point. Laura Bennett needed to disappear from Denver Community Church before she could do any more damage. Pastor Hargrove moved with the precision of a man who understood leverage. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply activated the systems that had always been his to activate, the ones built into decades of congregation leadership, board relationships, and the kind of quiet credibility that came from being the spiritual authority in a room full of faithful people who believed him. The diocesan investigator arrived Tuesday morning at 9:15. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she carried a leather portfolio and an expression that suggested she'd done this before. She sat in Hargrove's office on the second floor of the church administrative building, sunlight cutting through the windows in clean geometric lines, and asked to see every waiver Laura had ever signed. Every requisition. Every incident report. Every notation of a patient interaction that had occurred in that basement first aid station over the past 4 years. Laura found out about it when the church secretary called her at work. "They're asking questions about that veteran you treated," Sarah said quietly, her voice taking on the careful tone people use when they're delivering bad news on a phone line someone else might overhear. "The diocesan office. They want to know about your training, your certifications, whether you had permission to do what you did." Laura was sitting in the break room at Mercy General, her scrub still damp from a morning shift, a half-eaten sandwich in front of her. She set the sandwich down on the paper towel. She didn't reply immediately. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their institutional song, the sound of systems running whether or not anyone was paying attention. "Thank you for telling me," Laura said. By Wednesday, the calls had escalated. The church board received a formal complaint document, 12 pages, detailing Hargrove's concerns about Laura's unauthorized scope of practice, her reckless endangerment of vulnerable populations, and her insubordination and failure to adhere to established protocols. He had cited the Jensen incident from 2 weeks prior. He had cited the veteran's collapse. He had used language like serious liability exposure and a potential criminal negligence in ways that made each phrase land like a deliberate hammer strike. But the weaponization didn't stop at the church. Wednesday afternoon, as Laura was restocking a supply cart in the volunteer coordination office at Mercy General, her supervisor, a woman named Patricia who had always been cordial, always professional, asked her to step into the back office for a conversation. "We received a call," Patricia began, her hands folded on the desk, her eyes not quite meeting Laura's. "From your church. There are some concerns about how you're representing yourself in medical situations. Concerns about whether you're overstepping your volunteer scope of practice. About whether your training is actually being used appropriately." Laura sat very still. Her hands were folded in her lap, exactly where they had been folded in the back pew when she absorbed Hargrove's first insult weeks earlier. This was different. This wasn't public humiliation. This was institutional disassembly, the kind of carefully orchestrated dismantling that didn't require raised voices or dramatic confrontation. It required only the appearance of reasonable concern, passed through the right channels, spoken to the right people. "I understand," Laura said. "We're going to need to review your volunteer file," Patricia continued, and there was something in her voice now that suggested she didn't quite believe whatever Hargrove had told her, but she couldn't afford not to take it seriously. "Your background, your qualifications, the the scope of your work here. It's routine, but we need to be thorough. Thursday morning brought the certified letter. It arrived at her apartment in a thick envelope with the church's official seal embossed on the corner. Laura opened it sitting at her kitchen table, the letter crisp and formal, signed by Hargrove's own hand at the bottom. The language was precise. The reasoning was comprehensive. The conclusion was absolute, effective immediately. Your volunteer credentials are revoked. You are banned from church property. This decision is final and reflects the board's commitment to maintaining a safe environment for all congregants and visitors. She read it twice. Her coffee had gone cold. Outside her window, Denver sprawled beneath a sky the color of burnished steel, and somewhere in that city, a pastor was dismantling her presence one administrative document at a time. Sunday morning came like an execution scheduled in advance. Laura sat in the back pew, the same back pew where she had sat for 4 years, where she had folded her hands and listened to sermons and thought about things that couldn't be said in rooms full of believers. The sanctuary smelled like pine needles and furniture polish. Organ music filtered through the wooden beams overhead. 62 congregants occupied the pews, most of them older, most of them people whose faces she had learned over years of quiet service. Pastor Hargrove stood at the pulpit wearing his ceremonial robes, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had learned how to sound compassionate while delivering devastating news. During announcements, he began, "I need to address a matter of church safety that has come to our attention. Over the past 2 weeks, there have been incidents involving unauthorized medical treatment in our building. While we are grateful that no permanent harm occurred, the leadership has determined that we must establish clear protocols to protect our community." Laura's hands were folded in her lap. Her breathing remained steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind of restraint that came from 12 years of training in situations where breaking composure meant breaking the mission, meant breaking the lives of people depending on you to stay operational. Effective immediately, Hargrove continued, "Laura Bennett's volunteer credentials have been revoked due to serious liability concerns and insubordination. She is no longer permitted on church property. This decision reflects our commitment to your safety and our accountability to the standards we've established." He said it gently. That was the cruelest part. He said it as if he was protecting people. As if she had been the threat. The room didn't go silent. The room was already silent. The silence was what came after, the vacuum where sound used to be, where people used to exchange glances, where whispers might have accumulated into sympathy. This silence was different. This was the silence of people who had just been told that someone they thought they knew had been dangerous all along. Laura stood. She walked down the center aisle with her hands still folded, her pace unhurried. She didn't look left or right. She didn't acknowledge the faces turning toward her. She simply moved with the kind of precision that came from moving through space as a weapon instead of a person, compact, efficient, utterly controlled. She reached the door. She opened it. She stepped into the parking lot where her car waited, and the cold Denver air hit her face like a slap from something honest. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 days later when she sat in the waiting room at Mercy General wearing the clothes of a patient instead of the clothes of a volunteer. When she held a clipboard with an intake form instead of a medical chart. When she sat among the veterans she had once treated in uniform, the same men whose blood she had stanched, whose oxygen she had monitored, whose lives she had kept steady through her hands, and she couldn't tell them anything because she was supposed to be nobody. A nurse called her name. Laura followed her down the corridor. In an examination room that smelled like hand sanitizer and institutional grief, she sat across from Dr. Morrison, who didn't know her, who saw only a woman presenting with anxiety and insomnia and a request for psychiatric evaluation. "When did the symptoms start?" Dr. Morrison asked, pen poised above his clipboard. Laura wanted to tell him the truth. She wanted to tell him that the symptoms had started approximately 48 hours after a pastor named Hargrove had made a series of phone calls calculated to systematically remove her from every environment where she was visible, where she was useful, where she was anything other than disappeared. But she couldn't say that. Not here. Not when saying it would only prove that she was exactly the kind of unstable, troublemaking person they had already decided she was. "A few days ago," she said instead. It came on very suddenly. In her apartment that night, sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark, she opened the bottom drawer of her closet. Buried under winter clothes that she never wore in Denver, she found them, the combat boots she had kicked off 13 years earlier in a forward operating base outside Fallujah. They were creased along the sides from deployment. They were scuffed along the heel. They still smelled faintly of desert sand and machine oil and the weight of things that couldn't be forgotten. She had kept them hidden because the boots were proof. The boots were evidence. The boots were the only physical thing connecting Laura Bennett, the church volunteer, to Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, who had run point on operations that were still classified, who had rappelled down a burning building to extract for Rangers, who had held pressure on 17 gunshot wounds in a single afternoon and never let her hands shake. She held the boots against her chest and sat in the darkness, and she didn't cry. Senior Chief Petty Officers didn't cry about things like institutional exile or the systematic erasure of their presence, but she understood something in that moment with absolute clarity. Hargrove had been right about one thing. She didn't belong in that church anymore. But not for the reasons he had stated. She didn't belong there because she had tried to hide something that was too large to hide, and the moment she had used her training to save a man's life, the moment she had performed a needle decompression while people watched, she had set in motion something that could only end one way. Her identity was already dying. The question now was whether it would die quietly in the dark, or whether it would be dragged into the light. 3 days of silence. That's how long Laura had stayed in her apartment after the termination letter arrived, the formal document printed on church letterhead, her volunteer credentials revoked in language so institutional it felt like a death certificate. 3 days of watching the rain hammer the windows, of the apartment walls closing in like they were made of pressure rather than drywall. The boots sat on her kitchen table, where she'd placed them that first morning. She couldn't stop looking at them. Now she was walking into Mercy General through the main entrance instead of the side door where staff entered. Not toward the volunteer station on the 3rd floor. Toward the psychiatric waiting room on the 2nd level, past the elevator banks, through the corridor that smelled like industrial disinfectant and human resignation. Her hands felt wrong in civilian clothes, jeans and a grey sweater instead of scrubs. No badge clipped to her waist. No ID that meant anything. The waiting room was dim, fluorescent lights casting everything in a jaundiced glow. 8 chairs bolted to the floor. 5 of them occupied. For veterans, a woman whose age could have been 30 or 60, all of them staring at nothing with the particular quality of people waiting to be told something about themselves they already knew. The receptionist glanced up, processing a new arrival, then looked back at her screen. Laura Saturday. She clutched the boots. They were battered leather, the kind that survived things. Desert tan, scuffed at the heel from 14 years inside a bedroom closet, the laces frayed where she'd yanked them too hard one night in 2009 when the classified cable came through ordering her to disappear. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett was to be erased from every roster, every record, every official document that mattered. The operation in Baghdad, the one where she'd run point through a kill zone with 12 Rangers bleeding out and needing extraction, that operation never happened. The people she'd saved never existed. Her role in their survival was a ghost story. The woman across from her stared at the boots. Then at Laura's face. Recognition flickered. The woman was a veteran too, probably mid-50s, the kind of hard years written into the corners of her eyes that only came from seeing things most people never did. She nodded slightly. Just that. A nod that said, "I know what you are," which was somehow worse than screaming. Laura closed her eyes. Baghdad flooded back, not in fragments but in perfect sensory detail, the way trauma stored things. The weight of the 416 Hong Kong dollars across her chest, the magazine pouches heavy with ammunition, her boots pounding tile as they moved through the Jolin district toward the extraction point. The Rangers were bleeding. Rounds were coming from 3 directions, snapping through the air like angry wasps. Sergeant Mitchell had a sucking chest wound and she'd packed it with gauze while rounds tore through the wall beside her head, and she'd kept moving because stopping meant 12 men died and she wasn't built to let that happen. The receptionist called a name. not hers. A veteran stood, shuffled into the back. The waiting room was quieter now. 6 people waiting. 5 of them probably wondering what was wrong with them. One of them knowing exactly what was wrong with herself, that she'd spent 14 years pretending to be someone else and now that lie was the only thing keeping her alive. Her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket with the feeling of reaching into quicksand. Text from her son, "Mom, I told General Hale what happened. He says he knows you. He's flying to Denver." The words didn't land in sequence. They landed all at once, a complete catastrophe compressed into one blue notification. General Marcus Hale. The Army Ranger whose extraction she'd coordinated 14 years ago, whose team had been pinned down in a compound in Fallujah while air support was 47 minutes out and she'd made the call to go in with a small QRF instead of waiting. Hale had been a captain then, before the Pentagon medals and the command positions and the security clearances that went so deep they touched satellites. His son was Corporal Jensen, the young Marine she'd treated for asthma at the church. The one Pastor Hargrove had used as leverage to prove she was overstepping, to establish that she wasn't qualified to make her own medical decisions, let alone anyone else's. She stood. The boots slipped from her lap onto the waiting room floor. No one picked them up. The intake form on her lap, list any military service history, was still blank where she'd written not applicable that morning. The lie that had kept her invisible was now a ticking clock. She walked out without checking in. The elevator descended. She watched the numbers count down. 7. 6. 5. The feeling in her chest was not anxiety. It was worse. It was recognition. It was the moment before a breach, that suspended second when the target realizes the team is already inside. Her entire architecture of invisibility, 14 years of careful construction, of volunteer work and part-time nursing and scrubs that meant nothing and a name that belonged to someone who'd never been decorated, never been deployed, never held a dying ranger and whispered that the medevac was 3 minutes out, all of it was about to collapse. The elevator opened on the ground floor. She walked through the lobby of Mercy General, past the information desk, past the security guard who'd never seen her before, out into the Denver afternoon where the sky was the color of old concrete and the rain had finally stopped, leaving everything slick and gleaming like exposed nerve endings. Her phone buzzed again. Another text, "General Hale says Sunday. Church. He wants to meet you there." The church. The place she'd been banned from by a man whose entire existence was predicated on his ability to control people who couldn't fight back, who had no institutional power, who could only be humiliated in front of an audience that believed his narrative. Where 17 years ago she'd walked through those same doors as a woman trying to disappear, and where now she was about to be found. The rain started again. Not a storm. Just steady, persistent, the kind of rain that wore things down by attrition. She didn't seek shelter. She stood in the parking lot of Mercy General, the boots still in her hands, and for the first time since she'd walked into the psychiatric waiting room, she let herself shake. Not from anxiety. From the recognition of what 14 years of silence had cost her. From the understanding that there were parts of herself she'd amputated so cleanly that their absence had become normal. From the magnitude of what it would mean to let anyone see what remained, the operational mind, the calloused hands, the voice that could command a room without raising volume, the piece of her anatomy that would never stop calculating survival probabilities and exit strategies and the 9 different ways a situation could become a combat zone. She'd traded her entire identity for a chance to be invisible. And invisibility was ending. By the following Sunday, everything would change. But first she had to survive the in-between space, the 3 days where she was neither the woman she pretended to be nor the operator she actually was, but something fractured and incomplete, existing in the liminal space between identities, where the pressure of holding both possibilities was so immense it was starting to kill her. The following Sunday arrived like an exhaled breath after drowning. Pastor Dale Hargrove stood at the pulpit of Denver Community Church, his voice rolling across the sanctuary with the practiced cadence of a man certain of his righteousness. Humility, he was saying, fingers spread against the polished wood as though pressing his faith into the grain itself. True humility means knowing your place, accepting authority, submitting to the order God has established. His tie was pressed knife-sharp. His shoes reflected the stained glass. He had no idea what was gathering behind him. At the back of the sanctuary, a 17-year-old boy in dress blue stood motionless, holding a shadow box against his chest like a shield. Beside him, an elderly man whose lungs Laura had saved stood with his jaw set. Behind them, a general in service dress uniform waited with the patience of someone who had spent a career executing plans other people couldn't imagine. The rotor wash of the helicopter that brought him from Peterson Space Command Center still seemed to hum in the air around him. Hargrove continued his sermon, his voice the color of old money and older certainties. Some people want to be heroes. They want recognition. But the truly humble understand that serving means accepting boundaries, understanding your limitations. He smiled at his own words, knowing when to step back and let qualified people. The sanctuary doors opened. Not a sound. Just the movement of air, cold from outside, carrying the smell of rain and asphalt and something else. Something electric. Laura's son walked down the center aisle. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound was precision itself, military cadence, the gait of someone who had learned to move through hostile spaces with purpose. In his hands, the shadow box caught the light. Inside, beneath spotless glass, sat medals that had been buried longer than he had been alive. Hargrove's sentence fractured. He turned. He saw the uniform first. Then the box. Then his face went the color of bleached bone. "My name is Michael Bennett," the boy said, and his voice, God, his voice carried the weight of someone much older. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, United States Navy." He walked to the altar. The sound of his boots echoed in the silence like a countdown. He placed the shadow box on the polished wood directly beneath the cross. The congregation didn't breathe. 53 people in the pews, Laura counted them later, each face a photograph in her mind, and none of them moved. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song. A child dropped a crayon somewhere in the back. It rolled across tile like a tiny emergency signal. The elderly veteran stepped forward. Walter Krantz. Walter, who had been lying on the gym floor with his chest collapsing inward, whose ribs Laura had felt compressing around a pocket of air that was killing him. Walter moved to the altar with the bearing of someone who had worn dress uniforms since before most of the congregation was born. Bronze Star. He pointed at the first decoration. His voice was gravel and certainty. For leadership under fire in Anbar Province, 2009. Silence. Silver Star. His finger moved. For saving 12 Rangers during an ambush in Sanjan Valley. She ran through sniper fire to reach wounded soldiers. That's not bravery. That's something beyond bravery. The camera crew that had somehow materialized in the back pews, Laura would never learn how they knew, how the story had already begun moving faster than her own feet could carry it, caught Hargrove's face. His hand reached for the pulpit. Missed. 2 purple hearts, Walter continued, his voice never wavering. 1 from shrapnel in Fallujah. 1 from an IED blast that killed the soldier next to her. And then, he paused. The longest pause. The kind of pause that could hold entire wars. The Navy Cross. For Valor under fire. For refusing to leave a position when every tactical assessment said she should. For holding a defensive perimeter while 16 Rangers extracted a captured pilot from a structure that was being leveled by artillery. Someone in the front pew made a sound. Not quite a gasp. Not quite a sob. The doors at the back of the sanctuary opened again. This time, the air changed. It was the way the air changed in a hospital when a trauma team arrived, that specific pressure shift that came from organized power about to move through space. General Marcus Hale walked down the aisle in full dress uniform. Service dress with decorations, every ribbon placed with the precision of someone who understood that uniforms were language. His presence made the sanctuary feel smaller, as though the walls had moved inward to acknowledge him. His boots made no sound despite their weight. That was training, the ability to move through space without disturbing it unless you chose to. He stopped at the altar. His eyes found Laura's across the distance of 30 pews. He had flown from Peterson. He had taken a helicopter because this moment could not wait for roads. "I am General Marcus Hale, Army Ranger Command," he said, and his voice was the voice of someone who had been giving orders that other people died following. "This woman ran point on an operation in Baghdad that extracted my team from a kill zone. We walked into that compound certain we wouldn't walk out. Senior Chief Petty Officer Bennett made that choice possible." The general turned to the cameras, to the witnesses, to Hargrove standing frozen against the pulpit like something that had been struck mid-motion. "The FBI classified this operation so deeply that we had to bury her identity. 14 years. She could not speak about it. Could not acknowledge it. Could not let anyone know what she had sacrificed. That's not just military service. That's honor you don't see measured in uniforms." Hargrove's mouth opened. His eyes were very wide. Very round. Like someone watching an earthquake occur in real time. Pastor Hargrove attempted to silence a decorated combat veteran from serving her community. The general continued, his voice staying level, staying calm. "He banned her from this church. He revoked her credentials. He did this while she carried secrets that could have changed the course of policy if she had ever broken silence. He did this to a woman who chose invisibility to protect ongoing missions and personnel still in theater." The bishop stood up from the third pew. Laura hadn't seen him arrive. He was moving toward the pulpit with the grim purpose of someone executing a decision that had already been made before the service started. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of institutional authority finally being wielded correctly. "Effective immediately, Pastor Dale Hargrove is terminated from his position at Denver Community Church. The diocese will conduct a full review of his practices. Security will escort him from the building now." "Now wait," Hargrove's voice cracked like a boy's. "This is insane. I was protecting the church from liability. How was I supposed to know she was military? She never said anything." The cameras caught every word. The video would be uploaded within the hour. By midnight, it would have 4 million views. By Tuesday, it would be the lead story on every news outlet in Colorado. The phrase, "How was I supposed to know?" would become the rallying cry of people who had sat in silence while decorated veterans were humiliated in their own sanctuaries. Security moved him out. Not roughly. Professional. The kind of removal that still managed to be more devastating than any shouted confrontation. Hargrove protested as his own failure walked him toward the doors. His wife sat in the fifth pew and did not look at him as he passed. By the following Friday, she had filed for separation. The applause started in the front pew. Laura's son initiated it, and then Walter Krantz joined him, and then the general's fist came down once against his thigh in the sharp gesture that passed for deep emotional response in military culture, and then the entire congregation rose like a single organism recognizing its own survival. The camera lights made everything look holy and terrible. 6 months later, a reporter doing a human interest follow-up story on what had happened to Hargrove found him selling liability insurance from a folding table outside a strip mall on Colfax Avenue. His suit was rumpled. His eyes had the hollow quality of someone who had finally understood that he had been the antagonist in a story he thought was about his own righteousness. Veterans would sometimes walk past his table. He would flinch. He would never recover the version of himself that had occupied that pulpit with such certainty. The church had transformed Laura's corner of the basement into the Laura Bennett Memorial First Aid Station. Fully equipped. Staffed by volunteer EMTs and nurses who understood what it meant to serve quietly. Her shadow box hung on the wall beneath a plaque with her name and dates and a single line, "Those who serve in silence shape the world in the dark." But Laura herself stood at the Denver Veterans Affairs Hospital at a different kind of altar. A military ceremony. Dress uniform. Her worn combat boots, the leather cracked, the laces frayed, the soles worn through in places where she had run through Baghdad streets, finally placed in a memorial display honoring those who had served in classified operations. Operations that officially never happened. Soldiers who technically did not exist. Heroes buried so deeply in silence that even they sometimes forgot their own names. Her son stood beside her in his own uniform. General Hale stood on her other side, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. The touch meant nothing casual. It meant gratitude for extracted teams. It meant recognition of choices made in darkness. Walter Krantz spoke at the ceremony, his voice stronger than it had been in the sanctuary. "This woman saved my life twice," he said, looking at the camera and meaning it only for those who would understand. "Once in a church when my lungs were collapsing. Once in Baghdad when I was pinned down and she ran through sniper fire to reach me. That's who you're looking at. That's what quiet looks like when it's actually a lion." The reception afterward took place in a room with pale blue walls and the smell of institutional coffee and something cleaner underneath, the smell of places where people came to heal. A young nurse approached Laura. Maybe 22. Eye sharp with the kind of intelligence that made you dangerous in a good way. "Did you really serve in combat?" the nurse asked. Laura looked at her. She had spent so long being invisible that being seen required an entirely different set of muscles. She touched the memorial display that held her boots, her fingers finding the leather grain she could have recognized in absolute darkness. "Some missions require you to be invisible," Laura said, and her voice was steady now. Her voice had been transformed through the acts of speaking truth into something that no longer needed to apologize. "But you're never really gone. The work continues. The silence continues. And sometimes, very rarely, the silence breaks, and people finally understand what they were standing next to the whole time." The young nurse nodded like she understood, and maybe she did, or maybe she was simply beginning to understand that power looked like someone who had learned to carry weight without requiring acknowledgement for the weight they carried. The camera pulled back. Laura stood with her son and General Hale. Behind them, the memorial wall displayed dozens of names and photographs of soldiers who had served in operations that officially never happened. Their silence protecting others still in harm's way. Their invisibility the price of other people's safety. Their sacrifice the kind that nobody counted because it had to remain uncounted to be effective. The closing text appeared over the image, "Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs." If you've ever known someone carrying secrets that could change everything, someone whose silence was actually sacrifice, share their story in the comments. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of the ones we don't see but should. Like this video if you believe decorated veterans deserve better than what they received.